Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about the Model Context Protocol. It's a part of AI that people have been talking about, it seems, as a huge amount of interest. There's a lot of activity in terms of what's going on. And we wanted to jump in and actually get a little background established. And joining me to do that today, we've got three members of the Analysts team, Jean Atelsek, James Curtis, and Henry Baltazar. Welcome back to you all.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here.
Well, and thank you for joining. I guess Model Context Protocol, or MCP, is the hot AI topic du jour, de month, de quarter. And it seems like everybody has a particular angle on it. But I guess before we get too far along, Jean, you've just written an MCP primer. So can you give our listeners a little background? What is MCP?
Okay, MCP was developed it's an open source protocol published by Anthropic, which is the maker of the Claude large language model, designed to be a universal adapter, kind of a way of agents and applications, AI-based applications, to be able to communicate in a common language. It prevents, developers of AI-based applications having to create a separate connector for each tool or agent or LLM that they're attaching to. And so it has the advantage of, and this has been a big problem in AI. It was that they had to, application developers had to create different connectors for various tools that they wanted access to. And when Anthropic released this, it seemed to, I think a lot of the popularity of it is not only because it solved a vexing and kind of pervasive problem, but it also gave all kinds of vendors, software vendors, and storage vendors a way to participate in this whole agentic AI revolution that involved exposing their data or their tools in a certain way and making it possible, this whole, the notion of having agents being able to do work on your behalf, making it possible by allowing those agents to communicate with each other and with the large language model in a way that gave them context from the model, as opposed to having to, have the model figure it out every single time what it was that, you were expecting it to deliver.
And this is something that's really a step beyond API interfaces. This is something that, to your point, is really I was going to say opinionated interface. As you're saying, there's context associated with it. This is something that is really geared towards being able to create a standard interface to be able to enable agents to communicate and to be able to talk to whatever those sources of data happen to be, but do it in ways in which there's at least some understanding of what's exchanging across those interfaces. And that's an area, Jim, we think about some of the aspects of perspectives about what we've been trying to do to build some of this. That's, of course, right in the middle of all of the AI application construction efforts that are happening. And a lot of the ways that people have been trying to get beyond just custom scaffolding to make these things talk to each other, to be able to go bind together all the elements of an application.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, the MCP protocol really is this idea that we're going to give a standard way, as G mentioned, we're going to have a standard way to sort of communicate to things. And LLM models and other agents and things are, they are inherently sort of deficient, meaning like there's not, models are good at certain things, but they also lack certain knowledge. And so by default, you need access to other systems. You need context, things to brought in. And so the MCP is really sort of a client server model. And so in the world I live in, and I guess Henry to some extent, is that our coverage area is primarily around mine's databases or whether it's storage for Henry, these are systems of data. These are systems of information that are stored. And MCP provides the access to those systems, right? In sort of a unified way. It says there's a client, LLM, whatever, it wants to talk to, say, a database. As long as it aligns with the protocol parameters, it can get access to that data. Where before it was much more sort of specific as Gene was sort of rolling out. And so in my world, all the database vendors are saying, hey, we have an MCP server. And these things are growing like crazy because they're basically saying, here's a front end interface to the data, to the data of the world. And this is then opening up, our ability to sort of progress and move the capabilities of what an AI application can do because it has access to this data. So.
Well, and Henry, I guess the thing that you've seen is that it seems like every storage provider out there has all of a sudden sprouted a whole herd of MCP servers.
Yeah, I think when I looked at it, what's interesting about it is it's really the power of standardization. I'm not going to be here to argue this is the best and has all the features and blah, blah. That's not my place. But when you look at the standardization, I think that's what's enabling the floodgates for people to start using these things. And the example I'll think about is like, obviously kind of from a storage perspective, let's look at object storage, right? Object storage early days, 15, 20 years ago, we were talking about EMC Centera. Well, Centera had proprietary APIs. Other systems after them, also proprietary APIs. What really blew up object storage? Well, probably Amazon S3, because S3 was out there as a standard API that everybody could use. And we started having the shift went from all these proprietary APIs to S3 and people developing on Amazon. And of course, everybody wanted a piece of that. So you started seeing the storage industry react with S3 compatible object storage. I think getting this type of innovation and this breakthrough early on like this, that's what's created the disruption. And I think that's why we're seeing this stampede of everybody trying to leverage MCP, which I've seen at virtually every trade show I've attended the last month and a half.
Yeah, because we're just back from a number. This is I guess we're getting close to the end of the busy travel season from the analyst calendar. But suddenly, as you pointed out, MCP servers are everywhere. And this is something that Anthropic had put together, but it seems like there's a pretty lively discussion about whether or not this becomes an open source project. Clearly it was published as an open standard, but I guess there's that question of whether or not it can actually find its way to some sort of community governance. But I've also heard the concern raised that this is moving fast enough that maybe this sort of community governance isn't the kind of thing that really is suited for something that is so rapidly evolving in this environment.
I don't know. I think I would disagree with that a bit, just based on some of the demos, some of the things I've seen just the last few weeks, and the use cases and some of these demo cases, not production yet, but very, very powerful, interesting stuff. Veeam had one of the earlier ones just a few weeks ago. Of course, since it's Anthropic and Claude, they were using a Claude client to talk MCP to their backup repositories and look for data. That's great, but then you have to start thinking about, okay, that's nice for an e-discovery use case, but do you want to give access to anybody using Claude to doing that? We have to start thinking about, okay, what's going to happen with the security parts of this and how we're controlling access to these capabilities. I think with HP's demo that we saw yesterday, they were using some of those capabilities to, hey, here's a file. Tell me what the potential compliance implications of this are. Does this break compliance? Lots of powerful, interesting use cases, and I think we'll see more and more of this. Because at the end of the day, what the MCP is allowing to do is allowing the LLMs and all these other things to access your proprietary data, your enterprise data, which is great and powerful and something we need to have. But I think it has to be done with the right levels of control, and also why don't we build a safety net for this too? Would be a bad thing also.
This is the constant story with AI, right? Which is we now have something that can ingest vast volumes of data, and enterprises are opening up, troves of data in various forms. And the first reaction is, wow, look at all this data. And the second reaction is, wow, look at all this data, as people start to freak out about this, because
Yeah.
suddenly you have something that can ingest and make sense of, deal with, address these very large chunks of data in ways that it's been really complicated to do historically. And if we think about the structured data world, Jim, I mean, from a database perspective, that's well, actually, I was about to say maybe that's more complex, more risky, but
Ha.
maybe not. But I don't know.
Oh,
What's
I've
your
got
thought?
arguments against that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the toothpaste is out of the tube, I guess, so to speak, and so now we're running down this hill. But I think the nuance here, which is kind of interesting, is that this proliferation of like I rarely speak to anyone now, briefings or whatever that like doesn't have an empty MCP server or something in the works or available like that. But I think the nuance here is that. Um, there are as the protocol does allow for things like tools and resources, and I imagine that your comment of, yes, we're going to open up, we're going to have access to an amazing amount of data as long as we follow this protocol. But I also think we'll see probably a tightening a little bit with tools and things, and tools are ways within MCP to sort of restrict what you can and can't do to that data source or that database or things like that. So while we're living in a pretty happy world right now, we'll probably see some restrictions, and we'll see, as Henry alluded to, we'll start to see some guidelines come in because it can get pretty interesting. Like you find data you want. Can you trust that server, the MCP server? Do you know who's behind that? So these are all kind of really interesting questions that raise all sorts of possibilities of nefarious people out there doing nefarious things against those that are just trying to get their job done, right?
Well, it seems a bit like the same kind of rush we had first to models, in which everybody was grabbing models. Then you had model repositories, the Hugging Faces of the world, and suddenly there was model proliferation. And it seems like now we're getting into a point at which we've got MCP server proliferation, and we we need to figure out how to make sense of that.
And
I,
it's certainly headed in that direction, right, Eric? Yeah. So yeah.
yeah, I don't know, Gene. In terms of where this is going,
Well, I think it's a matter of making sense of it and really having a trust framework for knowing that the MCP server you're talking to is secure, that it's not going to infect, something on your side of the equation. Um, I think that this development has really caused people to kind of retreat to their into their sort of knowledge domain silos a little bit, and kind of you know, get their data in order so that they can expose it without losing their competitive differentiation. In other words, you're not going to open your kimono of all your data and all your, algorithms and tools and throw them out there. So I think companies are being very strategic, and an advantage of MCP is that it gives you a way to sort of control your the exposure of your own information and um, your own IP in a way that isn't, that lets you participate, so you're not missing out on the whole ecosystem, but isn't giving away the store. So,
Yeah, that's an amazing point. I want to jump here for a second because it's extraordinarily timely as well. All the storage players, data protection players, they obviously don't want to miss out on the ad boat, and obviously they have the home court advantage of having your data already. So they're using that to leverage and say, "Hey, use us to help feed and and make sure your AI implementations are using your real data. That's how you're going to get your competitive advantage. That's how you're going to get the best experience." Blah blah blah. And crazy thing, stuff's happening right now. June 25th, Rubrik, who's a cybersecurity data protection player, They made an acquisition of Predibase, or announced the acquisition of Predibase. Predibase is a startup. What they focus on is they have a proprietary post-training stack for customizing models. So look at that type of acquisition, right? You already had the storage players thinking about how do we feed these things to the AI? How do we make sure we stay relevant in this world? Now you've got a backup player making an acquisition of a specialist who is specializing in that training. So that speaks to what's going on here. They now organizations could take their models or whatever models they choose on, and then use technology like the Predibase stuff to update it with their own data. Stuff's moving fast. I mean, now we're already seeing acquisitions.
Well, and you make an interesting point. And it echoes something that I think you brought up in a previous episode, which is the fact that if you're in the backup business, you've already built a whole bunch of metadata about all of that key enterprise data that you're backing up, you're storing. All of that stuff that's used for resilience purposes is also categorizing the nature of that data. And we've seen a whole set of the various storage infrastructure providers, whether or not that happens to be backup or whatever that particular pursuit is, already start to apply some of that intelligence they've got to data classification and a lot of those other tasks, which of course are really critical when you start getting into use for AI, an area where it's been hard to do in the past.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people don't necessarily want to tie the latest in innovation to something like backup, but at the end of the day, look at backup. Backup sees all your data, sees what's active, sees what's changing, and preserves that. Well, that's pretty interesting information. Now, if it's something that's like an inline process and data's coming in, well, that'd be a good time to do metadata tagging or other types of other elements there, so you can do more with your data, or do a better job of in the future finding your data or categorizing your data. So, yep, one way or the other, those vendors are going to continue to push their way into there and try to use their capabilities, to help organizations with that seeking of data, recovery of data, and also making sure that's being fed to make sure the models are up to date.
It's an interesting set of steps. Although, Jim, the database side, this is something where, in theory, we've already had, it's structured data. We've already had, hopefully, sufficient classification. You've got tables and schemas for how the database is put together. But that's also information that is useful just in terms of how data is structured to be able to get back out into agent environments.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on here, Eric. One is certainly most every organization's got some sort of database, and it's generally a system of record. And to change that database is extraordinarily difficult to sort of migrate from something else or to change out. Like once you pick it, it's a pretty it's a near permanent decision, and then all the complexity around the metadata and how that's sort of linked together, and it just creates. And if you have agents hitting that, you have to be really really careful of that, and so certainly to enable the promises of AI, you certainly need to tap into some of these metadata layers and semantic layers and things like that to sort of get at that, right? To provide this richness that will come through, right? And so not only you just getting, not even doing simple stuff, you might want to, these agents might want to do more complex associations, more semantics, more derived meaning, and we should be able to provide that. But it just has to be controlled in a way, as Henry's sort of alluding to. There's opportunity as well as risks that are sort of forcing itself upon each other here. So
Well, I guess one of the things that I see, and actually we're going to follow up with a follow-up episode to talk about some of the security aspects, but it seems like a lot of the protections that we applied in structured environments uh, could potentially be bypassed because, what do? You mask fields. You don't present data. And yet, if you're exposing table structures, if you're exposing other aspects about how the data is organized, it's, there's the possibility that, a model may be able to actually intuit some of those things that you're trying to hide.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when an agent wants to talk to a database, what is its purpose? That's different than, say, a human behind it, typing a query or something like that. Some of these things, right now, MCP certainly provides for, give me the right credentials and are you who you are and things like that. But I imagine that it wouldn't take very long for, nefarious agents and bad actors to sort of get around some of that stuff. Um, so yeah, we'll need to see how this plays out, but it's a remarkable opportunity. At the same time, we're all sort of sweating a little bit on our brow. So
Once again, big cheers of yay, followed by great cries of boo.
yeah, so,
Well, and we've talked a lot about the agent pieces, but Gene, one of the other things in your piece, you're also talking about that I don't know if MCP should be called more the model communication or the agent communication, but there is also an agent to agent specification as well.
Right, that Google, open sourced, and also I believe they also open sourced an agent development kit. So, what I have seen in terms of development of MCP servers, it's very much concentrated among, software development teams, which is where, AI has proven to be a big winner, and have an obvious sort of return on investment. So, um once I think people get the notion of how these agents can use the protocol, the MCP, to provide context to large language models and then retain some of that context through multiple steps of an agentic process, then the next step is having the agents be able to speak directly to each other without having to go back to the large language model. So, it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I haven't I mean, I've looked at MCP a lot more than I've looked at, a agent to agent, and the enthusiasm around MCP seems to be because it's um, a protocol that any company can, uh sort of use to kind of join into the AI ecosystem, right? The agentic AI ecosystem. The agent to agent stuff, I suspect, will be a little bit more sophisticated.
Well,
Um,
that I guess, hey, it's do you want to open your door wide to agents the world above? But yeah, well, we'll see. I'm not going to ask any of you to predict the futures on this because it seems like one, this is still relatively new. Two, there's a lot of influencing factors around this. But I am curious what each of you think about signs of maturity. Are there mileposts that you're looking for that we should be keeping our eyes open around, just in terms of watching this advance? I know, Jim, you talked about some of the potential authentication pieces. What are some of the things that we should be looking towards for MCP just as this evolves? Is it all just control? Is it, they've got rudimentary identity pieces? What do you think in each of your domains that we should be watching for as significant developments?
I'll go ahead and start. I think in the database world, and those vendors that are putting MCP servers, you know, sort of access to their data. I think what I'm seeing now is there's sort of two dimensions. One's going down is great. You have access to this, and you might be able to do sort of your basic operations on that database, right? Maybe these are CRUD operations or just certain access or changing what you would normally do with a database. But I think what we're seeing now is we're going to allow maybe some natural language onto that data. Sort quote unquote, talking to your data kind of thing. And a lot of this resides in what they call tools that reside in the MCP server. And some of those, I think we'll see as we mature, Eric, I think we'll see sort of some sophistication or tightening or whatever around, those tools, which basically are the gateway on what you can and can't do to that data source or what you can and can't do with that system. And I think once we sort of get, oh, hey, that was a bad idea. Let's not do that. Whether guardrails or whatever, I think that might be a sign of, hey, we're growing up a little bit with this, and I think that's where you might see it. So
With open source software, there's a lot of fear in terms of bad actors being able to manipulate it or to participate in it. I think having a repository of MCP servers that is credentialed by the companies that are behind them and maintaining them. In other words, like an app store or wherever where you know, the company maintaining it is behind it and is vouching for its um, uh, authenticity and its sort of putting its reputation behind its functioning and usability and everything. I think that will kind of help people kind of jump in maybe a little deeper and realize that creating a it's a creating an MCP server is a commitment, and it comes with accountability.
And we just need somebody else to help with some of that trust.
Yeah, exactly.
Henry, you think trust is on the other side of that? You were kind of hinting at concerns that this opens the door to that vast trove of unstructured data that's out there. Is there more that we should be looking out for there as well?
Yeah, I think exactly. I think that's what's going to happen next, or it's already happening. More and more of those players on the storage side and data protection side will continue to move up the stack. I think this Rubric acquisition, that's an interesting one, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more of those types of things as they try to integrate tighter in, because all the backup players were all trying to become more security players as well. Which is a result of what's happened with ransomware. So being part of that process, helping the organizations with their you know how they deal with proprietary data and using that to feed their models or training their models, that's an opportunity for them to get in line there, and also potentially they can sell data protection type tools for that, or they can sell security tools, they can sell all kinds of other tools after that, or compliance tools. I think that's why it's an opportunity that all of them have to chase. You have to be relevant going forward. It's just too much of an interesting opening.
Yeah, they've got that value. The question is, can they actually realize it in delivered capabilities? We'll have to see where this all goes. But thank you all for being on. At least this is the first round, and more to come.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
thank you very much, Eric.
That is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Fran Mediation, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be heading into some of the security concerns to speak a little more specifically about some of the issues that we see around MCP in authentication, authorization, more importantly. I think that everything that Jean and Henry and Jim have talked about certainly have raised a whole set of questions around that. So we'll be digging in even deeper. I hope you'll join us then, because there's always something next in tech.